So let's talk about how this becomes a truly global war. As you can see from the map, nearly every country in the world is involved in some way, whether they're a colony of one of the powers, or an associated power, or whether they are an enemy. And in this particular case, there's only a few neutral countries. As you can see, Spain, which is going through its own revolution. Ireland is not actively involved. They're independent from the UK, at least the Southern Republic of Ireland. You could see that there are some different nations like Afghanistan that are not involved. But for the most part, the entire world is involved in this war. We're going to see the creation of a strange alliance between three powers, two of which make sense and one really doesn't. And so we're going to see the United States form an alliance with the Soviet Union. And we really don't have any shared values, but at the same time we have a shared enemy. The idea is that we all want to defeat Hitler. Hitler stabbed the Russians in the back. Obviously Hitler has been a threat to the UK, and Franklin Roosevelt says we need all the help that we can get. So in this particular case, bringing Stalin into the alliance, it's not because he's a good guy, and it's not because Roosevelt and Churchill think that he can really be fully trusted, but it's sort of the enemy is my friend strategy. The other thing that's important is that the Soviet Union is right between the two countries that we're trying to defeat. It sits between Japan and between Germany, and so we see that there's a strategic importance to having the Soviet Union involved. And so they all agree at this first conference when they meet in Iran that they're going to push for an unconditional surrender of both Germany and Japan. And what that means is that Germany and Japan have to sign surrender and cannot get any concessions, that basically the Allies are going to dictate the terms of the surrender. Some of the other Allied conferences that we need to talk about happened at Yalta, which is in the USSR, and Potsdam, Germany. I'm going to actually give you a handout in class that lists all of the important Allied conferences that took place and what the basic decisions were that were made at those conferences. It was pretty clear, though, that the Soviet Union was already angling for more influence after the war, and so Roosevelt and Churchill understood that after Hitler was defeated, Stalin was probably going to be the next big problem, but for the time being, they were going to deal with him so that they could defeat the Germans and the Japanese. Obviously, the next unit that we get into is going to be the Cold War, and so we'll see how that alliance unraveled and led to new tensions. Stalin basically had been begging for relief. For this whole time, the Russians had been taking on the brunt of the fighting against Germany, and so he really needed the Allies to open up a Western front against Germany. You might remember from the First World War, there was an Eastern and a Western front, where Germany was fighting the Allies on the west as well as the Allies on the east. And Stalin was basically begging the British and the French to launch some sort of a counterattack on Germany's western border. And so the United States, along with the British, say that we will do this as soon as we're ready to do it, but in return, the Soviet Union needs to help us to defeat Japan. So once Germany's defeated, the Soviet Union would need to come in on the side of the Allies and help to defeat Japan. And so here is the man of the hour. This is Dwight Eisenhower, who becomes the Supreme Allied Commander of the forces in Europe, and he's going to be given oversight of the invasion to open up a second front in Germany. And this, of course, is going to become known as the famous D-Day invasion, the invasion of Nazi-controlled France on the beaches of Normandy. There were over 3 million Allied forces involved in the D-Day invasion, not all of them at once, but this was a massive assault on German-controlled territory in France. Several different beachheads were to be stormed simultaneously. These troops were going to be put on boats and brought over across the English Channel from Britain and to attack these Nazi-held territories of northern France. And it was a particularly bad situation because they were coming up to these really high cliffs where the Nazis had the upper ground. And if you've ever seen the opening scene to the film Saving Private Ryan, the film's great, but it's a particularly brutal scene where you see just how hard it was for the Allied troops to gain any ground. So many people died, and it was such a brutal scene, but yet this was going to be the factor that was going to change the tone of the war. And this was going to be the thing that was going to give the Allies the opportunity to push back the Germans for the first time. June 6, 1944 is the date. As I said, it's in northern France in a place called Normandy. 4,000 ships are involved, with Allied troops coming in to storm the beaches. And by August of 1944, just a few months later, the Allied forces are successful enough to liberate Paris from Nazi rule, which is a hugely symbolic moment in the war. So we're going to take a moment to watch a video on D-Day.
The following communique has just been issued by Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force.
Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
People of Western Europe, the hour of your liberation is approaching. All patriots, men and women, young and old, have a part to play in the achievement of final victory. This landing is but the opening phase of the campaign in Western Europe. Great battles lie ahead. I call upon all who love freedom to stand with us now. Keep your faith staunch. Our arms are resolute. Together we shall achieve victory.
So following that successful invasion of D-Day, starting in June of 1944, as you can see from this map, we start to see a whole host of armies and troops invading, moving up the shape of the boot, from the tip of the boot of Italy up north towards Switzerland. And then you see other landings that happen in southern France, pushing up towards the center of Germany. So this is really the beginning. It signals an all-out assault on Germany by the Allies. And again, just like in World War I, the United States being involved in this war is going to be a huge difference maker. Here are some photos from the liberation of Paris. And so by May of 1945, Germany is ready to surrender. They realize that their forces can no longer hold ground, and within a very short period of time, the United States is victorious against the Germans, which a few years earlier seemed impossible. I mean, there were people in the United States saying that we could envision a future in which Americans spoke German. That's how advanced German culture was, and how strong the German military was, and what had seemed unthinkable just a few years earlier actually happened, and the United States was victorious. We're going to switch gears now and talk a little bit about the war in the Pacific, because the war was actually fought on two sides of the globe, the Atlantic or the European theater, which is what we've talked about so far, and then the Pacific theater, which was really put on the back burner while we focused on the Europe First strategy. There were several different conflicts in the Pacific, and you notice that most of them took place on small islands in the Pacific. And this was because the United States strategy was not to go directly to Japan, but to work its way to Japan and hopefully not ever have to invade Japan. The commander of Pacific forces was Douglas MacArthur. That same Douglas MacArthur that was used to dispel the bonus army during Herbert Hoover's presidency, which led to the scandal that many people say sunk his presidential hopes. That same General Douglas MacArthur was put in charge of the Pacific Fleet. And the strategy that the United States adopted for fighting in the Pacific was called island hopping. And the idea was that we would send in ships and we would send in planes to try to reconquer island territories that the Japanese had conquered during their imperialist expansion, and that we would move a little by little closer to Japan and try to push their influence back. And as you can see, a little at a time, we did get closer to Japan, but we were very reluctant to invade Japan. There was a fear that a full invasion of Japan could lead to 1 million or more American deaths, a long, drawn-out battle, and something that we really didn't want to deal with. And it needs to be mentioned that at this point in the war, Franklin Roosevelt has recently died, and Vice President Harry Truman has taken over. And Harry Truman kind of falls into this position, and a lot of the war planning strategy and all that stuff had been conducted by Roosevelt. Harry Truman was left out of a lot of the decision making. He didn't even know that we had the Manhattan Project in place to start developing nuclear weapons, and he was informed of this on day one. You know, his advisors come in and they say, "Mr. President, you know, we've been working on a secret project to create the world's greatest and most destructive weapon, and that weapon is going to be operational and an option for you to use in this war within the next several months." And he's completely floored by this. He has no idea that this has been going on. And so once the atomic weapons become operational, Truman has to weigh the possibility of using them versus the possibility of a full invasion of Japan, which he really doesn't want to do. And so the story of the use of atomic weapons in Japan is actually a really dramatic one, and it's a great story. But to go over some of the basics of it, the main strategy is that we are going to drop an atomic bomb on Japanese civilian targets. And this is interesting. We don't choose military targets. We actually choose targets where there are a lot of civilians. And of course, this is very controversial because that means you're going to have non-military deaths of women and children who are not directly involved in the war. But Hiroshima and Nagasaki are also industrial centers. And so, of course, that's going to help push back the Japanese ability to continue making war. Leaflets are dropped over the cities before the bombs are dropped as a warning. And the United States basically says that if they don't evacuate these cities, that there will be complete and utter destruction of everything in the bomb's path. The hope is to use overwhelming force to get the Japanese to surrender. The Japanese were notoriously tough. Surrender was seen as a dishonor. They would rather commit suicide than surrender. And so President Truman believes that he has a tool in his arsenal that will force the Japanese into a surrender. And so we really look at this as a three-step process. The first atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th. It's a bomb nicknamed Little Boy. We'll talk a little bit more about the construction of the bomb and its effects later. And then after the dust has settled from dropping the bomb on Hiroshima, about 3 days later, the USSR, as promised, and we weren't sure that Stalin would actually keep his promise, but as promised, invades the Japanese territory of Manchuria. And this is seen as the Communist Army, one of the biggest industrial powers of the world, is now invading Japan. And to add insult to injury, later that day, the United States drops a second atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, nicknamed Fat Man. And this destructive power, coupled with the Russian invasion, convinces the Japanese leadership that there is no other alternative except for surrender. And it still takes them a few days to admit to that. And the United States has claimed that we have more of these bombs and we're going to continue dropping them until Japan surrenders. That's not actually true. We don't have a huge reserve of these bombs. We only have a few of them. But the idea is to make Japan believe that we will continue dropping them and to destroy every major Japanese city if that needs to happen. And so August 15th, Japan announces its surrender and then officially signs an unconditional surrender order in September of 1945. At this point, instead of taking up more time in the screencast since I'm nearing my 15-minute limit, I'm going to have you watch the atomic bomb video that I have linked to the Blackboard site. And this will give you a little more insight into some of the visuals of the destructive impact, but also Truman's thinking and some of his speeches regarding using atomic weapons.